Good afternoon. I am Julia Sparza, and I am here to talk to you and introduce you to our newest speaker. And if I can get my PowerPoint to open up, there it goes. I want to welcome you to the Go Consumer LA Health Initiative Discussion 5, How Can Your Personal Beliefs Affect Your Information Interactions? And we have a wonderful speaker, but let me tell you a little bit about this project before we get started. This project is an international education program that is meant to provide free, short, on-demand consumer health education for the librarian, information professional, or their staff. If you complete a minimum of 12 hours, including the Beyond an Apple a Day, individuals can use this education to apply for the Consumer Health Information Specialization through the Medical Library Association. That's up to you if you want to apply. It's not a requirement. You can attend any of the educational sessions you would like. The video of this session in unedited format will be made available within a day. The edited and transcribed video will be made available at a later time. And the URL for that will be on the Go Consumer LA Health Initiative website, which is down there in number 6. So credit for these discussions are obtained after you complete the evaluation and the MLA evaluation. We have to collect data for the National Network of Libraries of Medicine, and then MLA has their own evaluation that has to be completed. Those in Louisiana who are information professionals or staff or consumer health people may apply to have the Consumer Health Information Specialization fee waived. And the process is described on the website as well for that. And this is our website right here. And we do want to thank the National Library of Medicine of the National Institutes of Health for the award that is making this education possible. So I am very delighted to introduce Catherine Arnott Smith. She is the Associate Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison iSchool, which I happen to love the name of that. She is Discovery Fellow and Virtual Environments, Wisconsin Institutes for Discovery, University of Wisconsin. And I am now going to switch control over to her.
Yeah, so hi folks. Are you seeing what you should, Julie?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry, I've made my screen big, so I couldn't find the button. I won't do that again.
So welcome, folks. I just want to introduce myself a touch by saying, if you're wondering, am I a former medical librarian? Yes, I am. I try to say that because information schools are very interdisciplinary places these days. I was a medical librarian in both academic and corporate settings. My first job out of library school at the University of Michigan, where I was actually a member of the last class to have a dedicated medical librarianship track. It's really interesting. That was 1992, and my first job was at Northwestern's Galter Medical Library, where I was, I think, Jim Shedlock's second hire, if anybody knows Jim. I then went to a very strange job in a corporate setting where I was a medical librarian supporting database development in an insurance company. So that was what got me interested in informatics, and I went to an NLM biomedical informatics training program to get a master's and doctorate. That was the University of Pittsburgh. It's now the Department of Biomedical Informatics, but when I was there, it was the Center for Biomedical Informatics. And I got interested in consumer health in part because of my teaching, because I ended up teaching classes full of people who didn't realize they were going to need to know how to deal with health information questions when they were done with their degree. So I have a lot of public librarians in my classes, future public professionals, and quite often working in libraries as paraprofessionals. And I got really interested in the problems of how to help people find good stuff fast in the sort of high pressure situation you are in a public library in particular. So let me turn to the readings. Why two articles? I wanted to explain why there's two. The term in academia for this sort of thing is least publishable unit, or LPU. And what it refers to is the idea that journal articles can only be a certain number of words long. And you want to get as many publications out about your research as you can. And you end up, to satisfy both those requirements, you end up addressing certain things in an article for Journal A and certain other things in an article for Journal B. So that's what happened here. So Smith, Hundel, and Kesselman focused on information resources. Kesselman, Smith, and Hundel focused on beliefs. I co-author quite a lot with Alla Kesselman, who is a cognitive psychologist, full-time researcher at NLM. She is located in the Specialized Information Services Unit, which is the same place that they do Tuxtown and the disaster information and disasters people, that unit. So we definitely need to keep information resources and beliefs separate, and I hope the article has made that clear. This picture is showing the social psychologist Amy Cuddy, who's attempting to illustrate her theory about power posing. And if you look her up in Wikipedia, which is how I got pointed to Wikimedia Commons for this picture, power posing was her proposition as a scientist that assuming a posture associated with authority alters hormone levels in the body. And that theory, by the way, has been completely exploded because science worked. A whole bunch of other researchers were completely unable to replicate Cuddy's results. So Cuddy's basically retracted her own work. But that's science, and that's part of the point of this guest lecture that the course organizers at the National Network asked me to do. I'm thinking about science a lot, I'm thinking about belief or not, and I'm thinking about good information practice a lot. So, here's a dilemma for you from 1975. To illustrate something, that is, there are challenges inherent in medical information provision that are really sitting in the emotional effects of information provision on the provider. That's where they're coming from. So Alla Kesselman and I edited a book which came out about 2 years ago called Meeting Health Information Needs Outside of Healthcare. I've given you a citation to that and a bunch of other stuff at the end of the lecture on the last slide. And I contributed a chapter to that book about the history of health information provision to the general public. It goes back a very, very, very long time. So it is not by any means something that only came along in the 1970s. It's way older than that, but the consumer movements of the 70s really accelerated interest and attempts to meet those needs from a whole bunch of groups that had found themselves disempowered in the healthcare system, something that resonates very much today. And then when the web happened, of course, that was yet another acceleration. But I do think it's important to understand the web didn't make it happen. It was already there. So for that chapter, I dug up what I think is a very timely and a classic ethical dilemma, which I think illustrates how personal beliefs can collide with professional service. So this was an article by a student, I believe, whose name was Ellsworth. And she described what we would call in library science programs a very early unobtrusive study, which is a fancy academic way of saying a secret shopper study of medical reference around a controversial topic, which was abortion. And Ellsworth's study was actually intended to measure the public library's effectiveness comparing to telephone hotline services that were designated for people to use when they were in search of information about abortion. So this study was running while Roe versus Wade, the classic U.S. abortion rights case resolved by the Supreme Court, was still being adjudicated. It was still in process. And that's what makes the timing interesting. Ellsworth herself visited 15 public libraries in the Washington, D.C. area between March and April 1972. And she asked librarians at each branch the same question. The question was, I have a friend who needs an abortion. Do you know where she can get one? In her account, which was published in a sort of alternative library press newsletter called The Unabashed Librarian, she noted the unhelpful response of one librarian whose immediate supervisor was, quote, unable to have any children, and the librarian herself admitted to mixed feelings about the question. That's from the article. This library was the only branch of the 15 where Ellsworth wrote she was, quote, not only told there was no information, but was given a decidedly chilly reception as well, unquote. And in 1982, the very first edition of a long-running series on reference services written by the late William Katz, he wrote, at one time, reference librarians hesitated to answer any type of medical question. A few librarians still believe medical reference questions should not be answered, or only in a non-committal way, such as sending the person to the card catalog or popular index or the shelf with the medical books. No other help is given because the librarian fears possible complications. So there's a whole bunch of things one could talk about with what's going on with medical reference, and I know you've had a week on medical reference already. What I want to focus on today is think about what that non-committal attitude is doing to the relationship between the patron and the librarian, and by extension, between the patron and the library. Because it's a fact, medical questions are quite often very sensitive ones, and they put real strain on a professional who may desire the appearance of non-involvement. There was an early consumer health study done in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1979, and for that survey, library staff were asked, how does your library handle touchy questions? And the responses were illuminating. One of them answered, very carefully. Another said, with great tact. And the third said, all are touchy and all are handled the same. So touchy was not defined by the survey givers, but the librarians all seemed to know touchy when they saw it. And one respondent offered a clue about what might be particularly touchy, which was the delivery of bad news. This respondent wrote, if we recognize the illness as being rare and very serious, we prefer not to be the one to give the patron the news unless their physician has directed them to the library. So that's another point where the relationship with the librarian and the patron is really mediated, affected, impacted by, depending on how it goes, how the patron got to the library in the first place. And the fact is, today, I hear very similar comments from my students who work in public libraries. They will tell me in class that they don't understand why I'm teaching them about health information because they can't answer health questions in their library. So, in 2017, this is still an issue. The fact is that touchy questions make librarians uncomfortable because they know patrons are uncomfortable. The librarian feels put on the spot to give a response that's both helpful and respectful of the patron's privacy, the patron's belief system, the patron's value system, and everybody's comfort level with the entire discussion. And that's a lot of weight to put on one conversation. So when librarians engage in a conversation, I think it's really important to remain aware of those ethical boundaries that may be keeping them from fully engaging as caring human beings, as opposed to caring professionals trying to do a good job. Recognizing that conflict, I think, is part of the solution. The librarian-patron relationship really needs to have the boundaries established in the librarian's role in the context of a library as an organization, because that's what keeps the organization in functioning and providing value when everything else is shaking up. And this picture I've got on this slide is a picture of the aftermath of the San Francisco earthquake and fire, where this wonderful, beautiful spiral staircase was standing and nothing else around it was. So there's an important sidebar from the principle of intellectual freedom, which is a principle on which, really by extension, every library of every type depends. And I think this sidebar has a lot of relevance to interactions between librarians and patrons. The age-old question has been, are librarians experts, guides, navigators, or advocates for a particular position? And how do the collections they develop and the resources they use to answer patrons' questions reflect this long-standing conflict in professional values? Like, how far do you go with being an advocate? So the principle that you shouldn't privilege particular viewpoints over other viewpoints, and that you have to have a broad scope of views. That's all summed up in the professional literature and has been for decades as information neutrality. So the ALA's Library Bill of Rights says this in point 2. Libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view on current and historical issues. Materials should not be proscribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. And a librarian named Marcia Pancake commented on the relationship that exists between intellectual freedom and the stated principle of neutrality. She wrote, "A huge web of trust maintained by everyone in the library makes intellectual freedom possible." And I think that's a really good thing to remember. So must librarians always be neutral, or are they times when they should be advocates? When we think about librarians' personal beliefs and how they affect information interactions, we're essentially asking, at what point does an individual's own value system and their own knowledge base clash with the professional principle of information neutrality? So I think it's important to understand the whole neutrality thing has historically been a contested position. It isn't like everybody's always agreed with this all the time. In the 1970s, there was a big debate after the dean of the library school at the University of Minnesota, named David Berningshausen, published a controversial couple of articles. And it was a real firestorm of stuff around these articles, which you can look up if you can get at Old Issues of LJ. Berningshausen was concerned about the emergence of progressive librarians, that's with a capital P, who were taking an activist position within ALA to advocate for specific social concerns and social responsibility. So this is all going on at roughly the time consumer health is coming up as a thing, accelerated by, as I said before, various empowerment movements by various minority groups. So this was the context in which progressive librarians were saying, we're going to be activists now. Berningshausen saw the progressives as eroding the core, he wrote, of the ALA because they were retreating from information neutrality. He saw activism itself as a conflict with professional values, and he called the social responsibility librarianship that was starting to flood into library publications advocacy journalism. So he was directly calling into question the relationship of the professional literature and the profession. So I would argue that when he did this, he was really calling into question the role of the individual librarian in the context of that profession, just what happens when a librarian decides to advocate for anything. So on the personal level, it's super important that librarians who are providing health information need to be aware they're librarians and not healthcare professionals. So that's a distinction that's embedded in the very basic understanding that consumer health information providers aren't educators. The role of health sciences librarians is not to educate or advise, but rather to serve as a natural resource for consumer health information. That's what CAPIS says within MLA, and I think it's completely applicable to public librarians and school librarians and information providers in all kinds of settings who are not healthcare professionals. So why is this hard? Because even when the librarian wants to be perceived as neutral, the library user, the patron, may not want the librarian to be neutral. The library user may actually want an advocate, a champion, a friend, a shoulder to cry on. The library user might perceive the librarian as a friendly person in a friendly, supportive place. In fact, much of public library marketing is directed towards making people think exactly that your library is a friendly, supportive place. So librarianship of the 21st century is challenging its practitioners to be advocates for their communities as much as their profession. And that's more tension between personal and professional that I think in consumer health we struggle with to an extreme extent. So let's think about the role of the belief system by thinking about censorship. There's three obvious dimensions where you can find censorship activity. One is governmental, one is local, and one is individual, which is the self-censorship category. So government censorship is concerned with how states legally define censorship and apply its interpretations. Local censorship is the sort you're going to run into most often in a workaday library of any kind, because local censorship is the notorious threat to community standards kind, the kind that generates book challenges from concerned parents, that kind. But self-censorship is maybe the most insidious kind, because since we do it to ourselves, we don't necessarily know we're doing it. Our detection mechanisms can then be very faulty, and our rationalizing mechanisms very strong. So one very strong and effective countermeasure to self-censorship, if you're developing a collection in consumer health or anything else, is your collection development policy, because the policy is serving a really valuable function of displacing responsibility across multiple people, not just one individual and their perspective. And the hope is that by, delegating these collection development tasks to that policy, we are creating a check and a balance on individual prejudices and individual blind spots. That's the hope. But as an individual fielding reference questions, you don't have multiple people involved. You probably don't have a policy to fall back on. And unfortunately, when I hear about policies for dealing with questions that relate to consumer health, they usually are ruling it out as a domain that they will help people in. It's more common with virtual reference, but I have absolutely seen numerous websites for public libraries saying we don't handle medical questions. That's not much of a policy. I guess it makes your job a little easier, but it's not much of a policy. So self-censorship kicks in really fast. And here's an example of how self-censorship might affect your answer to a question. The question would be, is it possible to reverse type 2 diabetes? So I'm part of a research collaboration that recently presented a paper on what happens if you type diabetes natural reversal, those keywords on the slide, into Google. My colleague Ala Kesselman recently presented this chunk of data at a health informatics conference. I've given you a citation to the whole thing on the last slide. What I want you to think about is what you personally might do if a patron came to you with this question. And these are the search results you found just by Googling. So the data on the slide here is referring to the first 3 pages of results by doing a Google search for those keywords in that order. And the 3 pages is way more than just about anybody looks at. Virtually nobody gets past the first page, and a heck of a lot of people stop at the top 3 results. But this is what we found. We eliminated pages about type 1 diabetes, any sites that required you to register and log in, any sites that were non-human, that were things about diabetes in animals, we didn't count those. And we ended up with 2 sites that were pure clickbait, like they basically want you to buy stuff. Click on this headline and buy stuff. Then there were 11 static, like not interactive web pages. There were 7 interactive pages that featured things like blogs where you could make comments and videos. And then there were 4 essentially digital articles that had been published in print before and were put up on somebody's website. So that's what we got. In terms of content, 11 sites were focusing on healthy living. So things about healthy eating, some of them had specific nutritional guidelines like paleo diet. Others were exercise. Others were, here's some supplements you should try. We also saw, less commonly, but we did see them, things about stress reduction, things about sleep, things about fasting diets, and regulating gut flora, which sort of means what you want it to mean. Then we saw 7 sites that were about specific foods or spices or vitamins or minerals. There was some overlap here with the healthy living. So we saw pages about cinnamon, we saw pages about potato starch and apple vinegar and grapefruit and ginger and turmeric, which seems to be the solution to everything right now. Then we found 3 sites all about fasting, extreme fasting, like 600 calories a day. We saw 1 site that promoted a vegan diet, and we saw 1 site which I will read from our notes on this one, and I think you'll be able to tell the kind of site it was, First, use a special nutritional protocol to kill the microbes and parasites. Remember, this is in a context of diabetes. Second, use electromedicine to devitalize microorganisms and re-energize the cells in the organs which were weakened by the microbes and parasites. So that's what Google points you at in those first 3 pages. I would like to take a pause at this point and talk as a group about how our personal beliefs come into play with this example of a question. What do we have to know as opposed to what do we have to believe to deal with this particular question? Can you see your personal beliefs affecting your answer to this patron question? If you did a quickie Google search and those were the sites you were looking at your computer, I'm throwing it open for anybody to talk. Okay, well, hearing none, I'll keep going. I want to tell you what the truth is, at least truth as defined by all the evidence-based medicine we could find. In terms of the Google search, here's what happened. One thing that turned out to be super important in interpreting these results, and these were coded by 4 people, one of whom was an MD, and the other 2 are cognitive psychologists, and the third is me. We found that the terminology used in the query actually really mattered, that simply the language of saying reversal totally tipped our results in a particular direction, which didn't surprise me very much, but it turned out to be important because my hypothesis is that our personal beliefs tip us in a direction of submitting a search query in a particular way. And we found that reversal as opposed to remission really, really mattered. We found one study, in fact, of the results that we came up with that concentrated on talking about here's the difference between reversal and remission, which was actually super important and a very, very good result to find. However, there were 14 sites that either promised or implied that complete recovery, and they actually used in most cases the phrase complete recovery, was possible. 11 of them promised it and 3 implied it. And the time frame that the sites claimed to reverse diabetes was within 11 days to as long as 10 weeks. So the language that was used to convey the information varied quite a lot. We saw things like this. In many cases, type 2 diabetes can be reversed in less than 30 days. This second paragraph bullet was from a newspaper article, which is, as a newspaper, it does not have citations, but definitely was pointing people at some good information about an extreme fasting protocol, which does in fact seem to have helped people reverse diabetes in under 8 weeks, which was absolutely fascinating. But then we had another one who said that type 2 diabetes was totally preventable, reversible, and manageable. So I'm hoping that the article you read where I was first author taught you a few things about how beliefs can intersect with reference interactions in the consumer health space. In terms of patron interactions, I think it's important not to stereotype before the patron opens their mouth about their understanding or lack of understanding of medical terminology. This is something that can really play into how we deal with patrons and how we deal with other human beings in general in any setting. And there's in fact a great variety of understanding and usage of particular kinds of terminologies. In terms of librarian behavior, it's important to be careful not to accelerate either toward or away from a health information question because of feelings on your own personal value system that are intensely pro or con helping the patron. And I gave you a 1975 example of that and the question of abortion, but I think we can all think of health information questions that are really deep, sincere needs on the part of our patrons that we're likely to have personal opinions about. So it's careful not to go too far in either direction because of those feelings. information resources, in this domain, you have to watch out for a bias toward or away sources because you consider them media or commercial interest driven. One thing I've heard from my students when I teach consumer health over the years is a feeling that if it has ads, it must therefore be bad. And it sort of depends on the question, right? I think that Medline Plus and the Medline Plus selection guidelines that in good librarian fashion are transparent and available on the Medline Plus website, this can be your friend. If you look to see why the Medline Plus librarians choose the links they do, I find them a very good guideline for choosing the links I do, just in my own personal looking. And they will, in fact, include commercial sites if it's the best source of information. And I think that's the hard part, is figuring out if it's the best source. Then there's the domain of a library itself. There's a pernicious myth that accounts for a lot of non-referrals by librarians, and that's the idea that the library can do it all. There's no need for anybody to leave the building. Everything is right here. Because sometimes the most help you can give a patron, I think especially in the consumer health space, is the website, the phone number, or maybe even the street address of the entity, the people who can really truly help the patron. And the patron wouldn't know about this service maybe if it wasn't for you. And so the most helpful thing you can do is maybe refer. That might be refer to another library. It might be refer to a hospital library. It might be refer to the academic library down the street. It might be refer to the web. But it might be the best thing to do to let yourself kind of give permission to leave the building. So that was actually my last. This is where my last slide before the citations one. I wanted to open the floor to questions about the Kesselman et al. Article, which is the one that was on the role of beliefs in dealing with that entirely hypothetical question, remember, about a connection between vaccines and autism. So I'm curious how you think those different librarians we interviewed, the staunch believers, the concerned believers, the tentative believers, how do you think they handled the question? I really honestly would love to hear from you about this.
You should see a little microphone if you can. Click that to unmute, or you can type in the box, in the chat box, and we'll be watching that. Christine,
Oh, Martin?
yes, Christine Martin had a comment. She wanted to hear the question you asked earlier again. However, Deborah Smith wrote, I agree, our hidden biases cause us to quickly stereotype and often inhibit the quality of our communication, conversation with patrons. So that was something she mentioned when you posted the other question.
Yeah, I see that. I totally agree.
So does anyone have any questions about, or just commentary on the article, which I had found it several years ago and was absolutely fascinated by the entire concept of how we as librarians have this bias that I never really thought we would have. So I thought it was very interesting to read this study. And then in our med school, we do the implicit bias, which is one of the things that we encouraged you to do, to see if you had hidden bias. And I've taken several of those tests, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so I had no idea that certain things that I saw in there. So I see a couple of people have written in. Lori Winterfall. So can you see these, Catherine? Have you got chat?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm looking at the chat.
I'll let you start talking again then.
Yeah, so Lori, I totally agree. I mean, once you've identified your well-vetted sources, it's really nice to have a mental list of here's my scaffolding for how I'm going to interact with people. And Medline Plus is actually my first go-to at this point in my life, all the time. Christine, are you asking me or everybody?
You go for it, Catherine.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about WebMD. I think my mixed feelings are mostly about that I see it sort of as a wrapper site. Like I don't see that much original content. It's more like it's pointing at content that somebody else did. And I guess my feelings about it vary depending on how well I think they've done the packaging or the repackaging of that information. I actually in my consumer health class, run an assessment exercise for the students who are from all over the map, like they're future medical librarians, future public librarians, nursing students, occupational therapy, you name it. And they quite often hate the ads. And these tend to be young people. These are undergrads sometimes, and they really hate the ads. And so when they compare, as I asked them to, WebMD and Medline Plus, they spend so much time arguing about the ads, they barely talk about the content. So for what that's worth, that's my problem with it.
Hey, this is Julie speaking again. I almost have a bias against WebMD for the simple reason that it has so much commercial stuff and stuff that as just a health, knowing so much from clinical care that I've worked as a clinical medical librarian, that is kind of iffy. I have a lot more problems, I think, probably than more people normally do with WebMD. So, plus it tells me I'm dying every day. So.
I will take the Mayo Clinic myself personally. If somebody said I could never use Medline Plus again, I would go to the Mayo Clinic first. I think their symptom checker is great, for example.
This is Julie again. Oh, wait a minute. I'm going to let Christine ask her question.
I think it is possible to attempt objectivity and attempt lack of bias, but I don't think it's 100% achievable because, see, I guess my problem is sometimes people will say, well, we're all biased. And like, yeah, but that's where we start. That's not where we stop. So accepting that everybody has a bias is how you attempt to wrangle with this problem, but it isn't a reason to toss all evaluation criteria out. Sorry, thanks, Anne. I will repeat that. So Christine is asking if there is such a thing as objectivity or lack of bias, and I'm just saying it's a goal to shoot for, and I'm not sure it's 100% attainable, but I don't think that should be a reason not to think and worry about bias, simply accepting that everybody has one. Oh, so Karen is asking, how about the patient info documents on UpToDate? Yeah, I teach about UpToDate too. One of the exercises I run in my class is I ask students to compare what you get for free from UpToDate on a particular topic, which happens to be kidney stones. And I ask them to compare what they get on UpToDate for free versus what they get through the licensed version my university has. And it's actually the nuances are what are missing. If people have access to UpToDate, you can try this yourself. But quite often, what I've found is the free patient information is essentially a teaser to get you to sign up. That it's depending on your question, it may not be remotely complete for what you actually need.
For me,
Julie,
Catherine,
yeah, go ahead.
When I was reading this article, the very first time I read it, I was so surprised that so many people were more concerned or with the vaccinations might have issues and other things. And so I found that very interesting that you know, granted it was a small group, but to find that they were given all the information out there and such that there was still this issue with understanding how vaccines work, and you know, and I don't know if that's because I'm working in healthcare, direct healthcare more, so I know more, and I don't know, but I just found this incredibly interesting that, you know, the staunch believers, there were not that many.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we were a little bit surprised, but the way I came out of this study was I thought people were, because remember it was a hypothetical patron, it wasn't a real patron. Yeah. So people seemed to be responding from their sort of, here's what I was taught in library school to do, and I should give my patrons a range of options. So I was less surprised by this result than my co-author was, because my co-author is a psychologist who studies like how people understand science. And she was really upset about some of these responses. Like the guy who pointed at Dr. Mercola, she was just completely freaked out by. And I think that guy who pointed at Dr. Mercola was attempting balance. That's what he saw as balance. That's the problem. I don't think that really would have answered a hypothetical patron's question, but that was his justification, like in the interview.
And difference between NORD licensed content and NORD free content. I don't know what NORD is.
Oh, that's the National Organization for Rare Diseases.
Oh, okay.
Where's that? I'm not finding that. I have to say I use NORD a lot, but I only use the free stuff. So I must not have reasons to look at the licensed stuff. So I'm afraid I can't help with that one. My issue with NORD is that they have a really, really elastic definition of rare. If anybody's noticed that, there's like stuff in there that isn't rare at all. And I actually am supervising a doctoral student who's living with a rare disease, and he was trying to pull together research, and he ran into, this problem of, he said he was finding stuff that he knew wasn't rare. So I contacted NORD to ask how things got in their database, and they said it was all self-submitted, that basically people submit things to be in there, and then somebody's supposed to go through and check, but their vetting process is really slow. So that's the free stuff, though. Maybe their pay stuff is higher quality.
It's about fake news, and it is from Karen, again, Martinez.
Yes, I completely agree. Karen's saying direct them to evidence-based info and scientific facts, and yeah, helping the patron make up their own mind, I think, is absolutely the way to go. And this diabetes pages, this is all part of a fake news study that my team is working on, and we're quite worried about it. Yeah, Christine, I have to say, Christine is saying, yeah, there's potential for side effects. I am actually the parent of a young person who could not have a particular vaccine because of side effects from the first one. So I've been in the interesting position of having pediatricians. My child is grown up now, but I was in the interesting position of having pediatricians try to convince me that he needed one, and then I'd be like, no, because his other pediatrician said he shouldn't. And so there I was trying to, the biggest challenge I had was convincing them that I wasn't an anti-vaccination person, but I had concerns about this one shot. And so I think you're absolutely right that it's important to distinguish what we know scientifically to be going on, which totally there are side effects, and those people should be getting medical exemptions like my child did. But that does not mean all vaccines cause autism. I mean, I will just put my foot right down about that one. And yeah, public health hasn't done a great job of the nuances there. I agree.
Once again, this is Julie. I think that I just finished a project on trying to find out why people were not vaccinating their male children for the HPV vaccination. And it's very interesting. There is a lot of wrong knowledge. They don't even have some basic knowledge about vaccines and transmission of disease and things like that when you're talking to just the average person who's coming into the clinic, who may be bringing their child in for a wellness check or something like that. It's very interesting to see when you start looking at how people think about things. So much is exposed to what they have seen over in general on the news and things.
Yeah, HPV is such a can of worms, where, yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally understanding of science leads to trust in science, and there are people who do not trust science, so they're not going to listen to anything you say. And that's why, I think that's part of why personal beliefs have to include giving the patron space for their own value system. And so all you can do sometimes is present them with the information that exists, and then you sort of leave it alone, because I don't think it's, I personally have never felt that it's information professionals' job to convince anybody of a particular position. However, I think patients and mothers of patients need to be given as much information as they can handle. That's part of making an informed choice about vaccination or anything else.
Deborah Smith mentioned that, being able to help in the time when you're actually working with the patron, try to give them those little hints about how you
Yep.
should evaluate and everything. I posted a link to a website that we had found and actually incorporating into our med school curriculum, using the criteria they use for vetting press releases and news stories versus the original articles. And so if you're looking for a reliable place to send people, or if you have somebody who comes in with a press release or something, and you can try this website and see if it's been written up there. And they go through it. They have a very strict methodology that they go through, and it really answers all the types of questions that you should know. And so I posted that in there. It's healthnewsreview.org, news release reviews. I don't know why they repeat that twice, but that's the URL. And Christine also wrote that that there is the need to acknowledge the neurological effects that can come with certain things. And yes, I mean, that's one of the things about, you know, the whole conversation that they have to have with their physician about the benefits and risks to any intervention that they'll have. And, you know, a lot of things, I know that one of the things that our pediatrics people are trying to do is just to get this conversation started. How do we get the people to even think about it instead of just immediately negating it? Because they want to discuss the benefits and risks with the parent.
Yep.
Karen brings up the whole issue of birth control and teens, and that is another issue that's tough for librarians, and I can see, you know, how do you negotiate that? The session before this, there was we had about the ethical and legal, what you can and can't say, and that was something that there are certain states where if a child or an underage child comes in and asks about abuse resources or anything like that, librarians actually have a duty to notify the police.
So they're mandated reporters?
Mandated reporters.
That's interesting.
So if they're aware of elderly abuse, if they're aware of other different types of things, the URLs are still on our website if you want to go and look. You can look up your state, and it's real easy to tell whether or not your state is included. There's not very many states that have librarians, but there are some. And you should definitely be aware if your state is one of them.
And so Karen's comment is, maybe Karen could clarify, is it information about, like, teen comes to reference desk and says, I'm looking for information about birth control? Is that the sort of context that a librarian would read into this?
Christine also mentions they should be getting sex ed in high school. Well, in the United States, that does not necessarily.
Yeah, depends on where you are, unfortunately.
I can tell you it does not happen down here in Louisiana.
Wow.
Not at all. It actually, they have an easier time having sex ed conversations in the Catholic schools than they do in the public, if you can imagine that. Sure.
Yeah, I think the piece of Karen's comment that I'm interested in is the librarian having moral qualms about sharing. So I don't know. The information's there. So the decision, I mean, what I've heard some public librarians in my interview studies say is that if they felt very uncomfortable personally, they would give the question to another staffer, like sort of recuse themselves from dealing with it, which I think is way better than not dealing with it. But wow, that's a hard one.
Yeah, I don't know about that. And that's one of those things where it comes back to that implicit bias that they try to get physicians and nurses to think about when they're interacting. So that's a very interesting. That should be another study.
Yeah, totally.
We could do that study. Sure. I can just drag myself into another thing. Sydney has another comment, and I'm going to post that in here. And I hope I'm saying your name right.
Oh my gosh, Sydney, I'm so pleased to see your question. I actually teach about Morgellons disease. So yes, that's right. It's something that has actually had several $100,000 of CDC research money thrown at it, and it doesn't apparently exist, but people think it exists, and they rally around that diagnosis. So it's not even really an alternative thing. It's more like chronic Lyme disease, which is another controversial diagnosis. And yeah, the trusted sources won't. So this is where my go-to would be popular sources that, while they don't have citations, will at least name researchers. So with Morgellons, for example, if you go to Time magazine and look for coverage of Morgellons, you will get pointed at people who have definitive statements about Morgellons, which is maybe all you get. And it really doesn't cross over into the sketchy information. Alkaline diet, I'm not familiar with. Yeah. You know what? If Sydney could send me an email, I actually have an article I can send you, which kind of gets at the whole how do you deal with this not making fun of people angle, which is, I agree, is very important. And I want to point you at this article because it directly addresses this, like how do you have good stuff in your library without being hostile to believers?
If you could send me that citation, I can add it as a
I will do that. I will do that.
To
It's about 6 years old,
resources.
but it's very, very good. So I still assign it.
We are at we are way past our time, and I want to appreciate all the people that were involved, and I want to thank Catherine. I knew it was going to be a fantastic conversation, and I'm so happy. And Catherine, I'm going to take control back from you.
Okay, go right ahead. Thanks very much, Julie.
I am going to just tell everyone about our next speaker. Our next speaker is going to be Michelle Spatt, as I consider the goddess of consumer health to extent as far as the work that she's done and what she's written about and her own experiences. So she will be with us. The next one is December 6th, and I'm going to now, the URL for this session for the assessment is, hold on a second, I have to actually get out of the PowerPoint in order to copy it and put it in. You'll go to this URL and you will complete the LIM evaluation, then you'll complete the MLA evaluation, and you'll be able to print your certificate right there. And I want to thank everyone for your time and attention, and once again, Catherine, thank you.